In the quiet moments of our lives, when the noise of the world fades away, we are left with the raw reality of our circumstances. It's in these moments that our faith is tested, not in the grand gestures, but in the subtle, everyday trials that seem insignificant to others but weigh heavily on our hearts. We live in a world that prizes self-sufficiency, that tells us to rely on our own strength, our own understanding. But the truth is, our strength is fleeting, our understanding limited. We are but fragile vessels, prone to breaking under the weight of our own burdens. Yet in the midst of our fragility, there is a call to something greater, a call to trust in the one who is unshaken, unchanging, and eternal, to trust not in our own abilities, but in the sovereignty of a God who sees the end from the beginning, who knows our hearts better than we know ourselves. Trusting in God doesn't mean the absence of struggle. It doesn't mean that life will be free from pain or hardship, but it does mean that in the midst of those struggles, we are not alone. We are held by a love that is steadfast, a grace that is sufficient, and a peace that surpasses all understanding. This trust is not passive. It requires action. It requires us to surrender our will, our desires, our plans, and submit them to the will of the one who knows what is best for us. It requires us to let go of our need for control and to rest in the assurance that God is working all things together for our good. But surrender is not easy. It goes against the grain of our human nature. We want to hold on to manage to fix things ourselves, but in doing so, we often miss the opportunity to experience the depth of God's provision and care. When we trust in God, we acknowledge that He is in control, even when our circumstances suggest otherwise. We choose to believe that He is good, even when life is hard. We choose to walk by faith, not by sight, knowing that His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. This trust transforms us. It changes the way we view our problems, our relationships, our purpose. It shifts our focus from our limitations to God's limitless power. It enables us to face the storms of life with courage, knowing that the one who calms the seas is with us in the boat. But this trust is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice, a moment-by-moment surrender. It is a journey of learning to rely not on our own understanding, but on the wisdom and guidance of God. It is a process of being conformed to the image of Christ, of growing in grace and knowledge, of becoming more like the one we trust. And as we grow in trust, we begin to see the fruit of it in our lives. We experience peace in the midst of turmoil, joy in the face of sorrow, strength in our weakness. We become living testimonies of the faithfulness of God, witnesses to a watching world of the power of trusting in Him. So, in every situation, in every circumstance, choose to trust. Choose to believe that God is who He says He is, and that He will do what He has promised. Choose to surrender your will to His, and to rest in the assurance that He is working all things together for your good. Trusting in God is not always easy, but it is always worth it. For in Him we find our hope, our purpose, and our peace, and that is a truth that will never fail. If you have any specific aspects you'd like to explore further or need assistance with, feel free to let me know. Real faith isn't about control or comfort, but about laying down our own will and relying completely on God's wisdom and timing, even when we don't understand. It's not passive belief, but a daily, intentional choice to trust God in every situation, especially during suffering, uncertainty, or loss. As we learn to trust God more, our hearts are changed. We begin to experience peace, strength, and purpose that reflect His character to the world. True trust in God requires surrender. To surrender is not a mere act of relinquishing control over something we are holding on to, but an acknowledgement that we are not the ultimate authority in our lives. It is an act of humility, a recognition that we, in our finite understanding, cannot navigate this world on our own. When we trust, it is not about us, our wisdom, our abilities, our strategies. Trusting in God, in its purest form, involves laying down everything we think we know and submitting to His will, His guidance, and His plans. The world around us pushes us towards self-sufficiency. We are taught to be independent, to stand on our own 2 feet, to build our own empires, to rely on our own intellect, strength, and resources. This message is drilled into us from a young age. From the classroom to the workplace, from the family to the community, we are constantly told that success and security are based on our ability to control, to manage, and to maintain. But the reality is starkly different. No matter how hard we try to control our circumstances, we are confronted with our limitations. Life is unpredictable. Circumstances change without warning. Relationships falter. Health deteriorates. Dreams are dashed. In those moments, the illusion of control shatters. We are left with nothing but a raw and naked awareness of our weakness and vulnerability. This is where true trust begins. Trust is not an abstract concept or a passive feeling. It is a deliberate choice, and that choice, when faced with the overwhelming challenges of life, is to surrender. To surrender everything we think we know. To surrender our ambitions, our desires, our plans, and our fears. To surrender our perceived right to control and manage every aspect of our lives. Surrender does not come naturally. It requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. It goes against the grain of everything we are taught. It forces us to confront our pride, our ego, and our deep-seated need for autonomy. At its core, surrender is an admission that we are not in charge. It is a relinquishing of the idea that we have the power to shape our destiny by our own will. But in this very surrender we find true freedom, freedom from the burden of having to know everything, freedom from the exhaustion of trying to fix and control every situation. Freedom from the fear of failure because we recognize that the outcome is not in our hands. It is in the hands of the one who holds the universe in his grip. This is not a passive surrender, it is a conscious, active decision. It is a choice to place everything in God's hands and to trust that He will do what is best. The choice to surrender involves an active laying down of our desires, our plans, and our preferences, and it requires an unwavering confidence that God's plan is greater than our own. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, offers us a profound insight into what this surrender looks like. He writes, "I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ." Philippians 3:8. Paul was not simply speaking of material possessions here. He was describing a life of total surrender. He was willing to lay down everything, including his own identity, his status, and his ambitions, because he knew that in Christ there was something far greater, a peace that transcends understanding, a purpose that cannot be shaken. Surrender is the pathway to that peace. We can spend our lives fighting to keep control, but in doing so, we miss out on the rest that comes from trusting God with everything. When we surrender, we cease striving. We stop wrestling with God, trying to convince Him that we know better. Instead, we trust that His wisdom is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Surrender requires the kind of faith that says, "I may not understand why this is happening, but I trust that God knows what He is doing." Surrender involves trust, and trust involves relationship. It's not simply a matter of submitting to a higher power out of obligation. but it's about knowing the character of the one to whom we surrender. The more we come to know God through His Word and through experience, the more we are able to trust Him. Knowing God's love, His goodness, His faithfulness, and His power gives us the courage to lay down our fears and our desires. We are not surrendering to a cold, indifferent force in the universe, but to a loving Father who cares for us more deeply than we can comprehend. There is a story in the Gospels where Jesus calls a man to follow Him. The man, eager to follow Jesus, says, "Let me first go and bury my father." To this, Jesus responds, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Luke 9:60. At first glance, this response seems harsh, even heartless. But what Jesus is saying is that following Him requires total surrender. Nothing must stand in the way, not even our most natural and important duties. This does not mean we abandon our responsibilities, but it reveals the cost of truly following Jesus. To surrender is to place God's will above all else, to recognize that nothing, absolutely nothing, should take precedence over our allegiance to Him. Surrender is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process. It is a daily, moment-by-moment decision to yield our hearts and minds to God. Every time we face a trial, every time we encounter an obstacle, every time we feel the urge to control or manipulate the situation, we are faced with a choice. Will we trust God, or will we try to handle it ourselves? When we choose to surrender, we are acknowledging that God knows what is best, even when the path He leads us on is difficult or confusing. Trusting God in surrender means walking by faith, not by sight. It means believing that God is working in the unseen even when we cannot see the way forward. This type of trust requires spiritual maturity. It requires the strength to let go, to release our grip on our lives, and to rest in God's plan. It's important to understand that surrender does not mean passivity. It doesn't mean we do nothing and wait for God to act. Surrender involves active obedience. It means that, as we trust God, we take the steps He has called us to take, even when we don't fully understand the bigger picture. Just as Abraham obeyed when God called him to sacrifice Isaac, or when Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, surrender requires action. It's not simply the absence of resistance, it's the presence of obedience in the face of uncertainty. In the face of surrender, there is also peace. This peace is not the absence of trouble, but the assurance that God is in control and that we are walking in His will. There is an inner calm that comes when we cease striving and trust that God will do what is best for us. When we stop trying to make things happen on our own and instead surrender to God's will, we are free from anxiety, free from fear, free from the need to prove ourselves. This is the peace that passes all understanding, the peace that can only come when we know we are held in the hands of a loving, sovereign God. True trust in God is not the absence of challenges. It is the peace that comes in the midst of those challenges when we surrender our will to God's perfect plan. Surrender does not mean everything will be easy. It means that, in the face of difficulty, we trust that God is faithful and that He will carry us through. It means that, even when life doesn't go according to our plan, we know that God is good, and His plan is better than anything we could have imagined. As we learn to surrender, we begin to experience a deeper level of intimacy with God. Trusting God with everything in our lives opens the door for a deeper relationship with Him. We begin to see His faithfulness in ways we never could have understood before. The more we surrender, the more we are able to experience His peace, His provision, and His love. Surrender is not about weakness, but about strength, the strength that comes from trusting in a God who is stronger than any of us. It is the strength to let go and to lean on His everlasting arms. It is the strength to rest in His sovereignty and to trust that He is always working for our good, even when we cannot see the outcome. Surrendering to God is the path to true freedom. It is the freedom that comes from knowing that we are not in control, and that is a good thing. It is the freedom to trust in a God who knows what is best, a God who has a plan and a purpose for each of us. In surrender, we find the peace, joy, and security that come from resting in the arms of a faithful and loving Father. As we surrender to Him, we are transformed, our desires change, our fears fade, our hearts become more aligned with His. We learn to trust Him more fully, and in doing so, we become more like Him. True surrender brings us into greater fellowship with God and allows His will to be accomplished in our lives. It is the key to living a life of true faith and true peace. Trust is active and tested in hardship. Trust, when spoken of in a spiritual sense, is not a passive sentiment or an abstract belief. It is a living, breathing force that is most evident when life is hard. It is easy to talk about trust when things are going well, when everything aligns according to our plans, when the days are smooth and the road ahead appears clear. But what about when the storm clouds gather? What happens when the journey becomes difficult, when the expected turns into the unexpected, when the challenges seem insurmountable and the future uncertain? In those moments, trust is no longer a passive or easy thing. It becomes active. It becomes a choice. True trust is not built on the foundation of calm seas, but on the foundation of life's fiercest storms. It is in the crucible of hardship where trust is truly tested and refined. The trials we face reveal the depth of our faith and expose the areas where our trust in God may be lacking or misplaced. The difficulty is not there to defeat us, but to refine and purify our faith. It is in hardship that we discover whether our trust in God is real or simply theoretical. It is easy to trust when everything is going as we hope, but it is in the dark valleys of life that the roots of our trust in God are truly tested. To trust God in times of difficulty requires more than just saying we believe. Trust is active. It requires action. It is a conscious decision made not in moments of ease, but in moments of tension, uncertainty, and despair. It is when life feels like it's unraveling, when everything seems to be falling apart, that trust becomes the most powerful act of defiance against the circumstances of this world. Trust in God during hardship is not about avoiding pain or pretending that things aren't hard. It's about choosing to believe, act, and live as if God is who He says He is, even when everything around us screams otherwise. It is choosing to hold onto God's promises when they seem the furthest from being true. Hardship, in many ways, serves as a stage upon which our trust in God is both displayed and refined. It is when we face difficult situations, when we lose a loved one, when illness strikes, when financial instability looms, when our dreams are shattered, that the true nature of our trust is revealed. This is where the rubber meets the road. In these moments, we are faced with a choice. Will we trust God even when we don't understand? Will we rely on Him even when the storm rages and we feel powerless? Will we trust in His goodness, His sovereignty, and His faithfulness when life feels unfair and His promises seem distant? The Bible is replete with examples of individuals who were called to trust in God during some of the most difficult times imaginable. Think of Abraham, who was asked to leave everything he knew and follow God into an unknown future. Think of Job, who endured unimaginable suffering yet declared, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him." Job 13:15. Think of David, who as a young man was anointed king, only to be pursued by the very king who had chosen him to be his servant. Think of Jesus, who in the Garden of Gethsemane prayed fervently to be spared from the coming agony, but ultimately surrendered to God's will, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22:42. These individuals did not trust passively. Their trust was active, it was lived out, and it was often tested to its breaking point. Abraham's story offers a striking illustration of active trust. God made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. But years passed and still there was no child. God's promise seemed delayed, almost forgotten. Abraham and his wife Sarah took matters into their own hands, attempting to fulfill the promise through their own strength, only to find themselves in a mess of their own making. But then, when it seemed too late, God fulfilled his promise, and Abraham and Sarah had a son, Isaac. The story doesn't end there, though. God then tested Abraham's trust in a way that must have felt incomprehensible. God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, the very promise he had waited for and received. Abraham's obedience and trust in God, in that moment of agony, reveals the nature of true, active trust. Even when God's commands didn't make sense, even when the cost seemed too high, Abraham chose to trust. The Bible tells us that Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead, and he obeyed without hesitation. This was not blind faith. It was faith that had been tested and refined. It was trust in the midst of hardship, a trust that was rooted not in Abraham's circumstances, but in the character and promises of God. Abraham's faith was not merely a feeling of trust, but an active trust that manifested in obedience. In the moments of difficulty, Abraham's trust in God was put to the test, and he passed the test not because he had a perfect understanding of God's will, but because he had learned that God is faithful even in the most painful circumstances. Job's story presents a similar theme of trust in the face of suffering. Job's life was marked by extreme loss. He lost his wealth, his health, and his family. Yet, in the midst of his grief, Job uttered the words that have become a profound declaration of trust. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." Job 13:15. Job did not understand why he was suffering, nor did he have an explanation for the calamities that had befallen him. But in the midst of his pain, Job did not curse God or turn away. Instead, he actively chose to trust in God's goodness and sovereignty, even when everything pointed to the contrary. Job's trust was not based on his circumstances. It was rooted in a deep understanding of who God is, a God who is sovereign, just, and good, even in the midst of suffering. Job's story is a testament to the active nature of trust. It is one thing to trust when everything is fine, but it is another thing entirely to trust when your world is falling apart. Job shows us that trust is not a mere sentiment or emotion. It is a decision made in the midst of hardship. It is an active, ongoing choice to rely on God's character, not on our changing circumstances. David's life also demonstrates how trust is active and tested in hardship. From being anointed as a young shepherd to becoming the king of Israel, David faced countless trials. He was pursued by King Saul, who sought to take his life. He faced betrayal from those closest to him, and he endured battles that seemed impossible to win. Yet throughout it all, David declared his trust in God. He wrote in Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Psalm 23, 1-3. Even though David faced hardships and danger, he knew that God was his refuge and strength. David's trust was not just a passive acknowledgement of God's existence, but an active reliance on God's provision, protection, and guidance. David's trust was not tested when life was easy. It was tested when he was in the wilderness, running for his life, facing enemies on all sides. His trust became real when it was put into action, when he had to rely on God's faithfulness in the midst of his greatest trials. And then we come to Jesus, the ultimate example of trust in the midst of suffering. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26:39. Jesus knew the suffering that awaited him on the cross, and yet he chose to trust God's plan. His trust was not passive, it was active. He actively surrendered his will to God's will, even though it meant the most agonizing suffering imaginable. Jesus' trust in the Father was tested in the hardest way possible, and he chose obedience even to the point of death. His life is the greatest demonstration of active trust. What do these stories have in common? They all show us that trust is not about avoiding hardship, but about learning to rely on God in the midst of it. Trust is not about having all the answers or understanding why things are happening the way they are. It is about surrendering our will to God's will and trusting that, no matter the outcome, He is good, He is sovereign, and He is faithful. Trust is active. It requires us to choose obedience even when we don't have all the answers. In hardship, our trust is tested. It is in the difficult seasons that we learn to rely on God's faithfulness, to trust His timing, and to believe that He is working all things together for our good. It is in the storms of life that we discover whether our faith is real or whether it is merely a theoretical concept. Trust is not passive. It is the active choice to believe, to obey, and to rely on God when everything else seems uncertain. In times of hardship, our trust becomes the foundation on which we stand, and it is through those trials that we learn to trust God more fully, more deeply, and more completely. Trust transforms our perspective. Trust is not merely about believing in something or someone. It is a force that changes the way we see and interact with the world. It has the power to shift the lens through which we view life's circumstances. When we trust, we don't just acknowledge the facts of a situation. We look at those facts through the filter of confidence in something greater than ourselves. Trust reshapes our inner world and alters how we approach both the ordinary and extraordinary moments of life. This transformation happens because trust is more than a thought or an emotion. It is an alignment of the heart and mind with a deeper reality. It changes how we perceive not just the outcomes, but also the process, the journey we are on. In the absence of trust, we are prone to fear, doubt, and confusion. But when trust takes root, it begins to shift our entire approach to life. When we choose to trust, we are choosing to believe that things are not merely happening by chance or as a result of our own effort. Trust redirects our focus from the temporary to the eternal, from the seen to the unseen. It takes us from focusing on the problems at hand to believing in the unseen providence of a good, sovereign God who is in control of all things. Trust transforms our perspective from one of anxiety and fear to one of peace and assurance. This is not a denial of the reality of suffering or difficulty, but a deeper recognition that, even in hardship, we are not alone and that God is at work. At its core, trust in God leads to the realization that our lives are not defined by the events that happen to us, but by how we respond to those events. When we place our trust in God, we understand that life is not a random collection of moments. It is a story in which God is the author, and we are invited to participate in His greater plan. Trust shifts our perspective from focusing on our immediate pain to seeing the larger, divine purpose that might be unfolding beyond our comprehension. We start to see God's hand at work in our lives, even in the most ordinary or difficult situations. One of the key ways trust transforms our perspective is by shifting our view of hardship. Without trust, hardships can feel like burdens too heavy to bear. We may see them as obstacles in our way, as interruptions to the life we wanted or imagined. But when we trust, we begin to see our trials as opportunities for growth and refinement. Trusting in God helps us understand that hardships are not signs of abandonment or failure. They are part of the journey of becoming who God has called us to be. The Apostle James speaks about this transformation of perspective in his letter to the early church. He encourages believers to consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. James 1, 2-3. This is an extraordinary shift in perspective. Trials which once seemed like enemies are now viewed as tools in the hand of God, used to develop perseverance and maturity. Trust does not minimize the difficulty of our circumstances. Rather, it changes the way we approach them. We no longer see them as meaningless suffering, but as purposeful shaping that can lead to greater spiritual strength. This transformation in perspective is also reflected in how we approach relationships. In life, we will inevitably face misunderstandings, betrayals, disappointments, and conflicts. When trust is absent, our hearts become guarded, and our relationships suffer. We become cynical and defensive, always anticipating the worst. But when trust is present, we are able to extend grace and mercy, even in the face of hurt. Trust allows us to view others through the lens of forgiveness rather than bitterness. We begin to understand that people, like ourselves, are imperfect, and that trust is not about perfection, but about faith in something larger. Faith in the redemptive work of God in our lives and in the lives of others. This perspective shift is not just about how we view others, but how we view ourselves. Without trust, we can easily become enslaved by insecurity, fear, and self-doubt. We may constantly question our worth, our decisions, and our abilities. But trust, particularly trust in God, transforms how we see ourselves. It helps us understand that our value is not rooted in what we achieve or how others perceive us, but in who we are as beloved children of God. Trust removes the pressure to perform and opens the door for a healthy sense of identity. Instead of striving for approval or recognition, we learn to rest in the truth that God has already accepted and loved us. Trust reminds us that we do not have to prove ourselves. God's grace is sufficient. This transformation of perspective also leads us to view the future with hope and confidence, rather than fear or anxiety. Life is full of uncertainty. We cannot control the future, and many things lie beyond our understanding. Without trust, the unknowns of life can fill us with dread. The future can appear as a vast, empty space, full of threats and dangers. But when we trust, we are able to face the unknown with peace, knowing that we are not alone in it. We trust that God, who holds the future, is faithful to guide us, protect us, and provide for us. Trust removes the fear of the unknown and replaces it with the assurance that God's plans are better than ours, and that He will work all things together for our good. Romans 8:28. Another way trust transforms our perspective is in how we view success and failure. In a world that often defines success by external achievements, money, status, power, recognition, it is easy to become driven by these markers of success, constantly striving for more. But when we trust in God, we begin to see success through a different lens. Success is not defined by the world's standards, but by faithfulness to God's calling in our lives. Trust leads us to redefine success as walking in obedience to God, regardless of the outward results. We no longer measure our lives by what we accumulate or how we are perceived, but by how faithfully we respond to God's leading. Trust in God helps us understand that failure, in the world's eyes, is not final. If we fail, we are still loved by God, and failure becomes an opportunity for growth and learning. Trust allows us to view every experience, whether it be success or failure, as a chance to grow closer to God and reflect His character in our lives. This transformation of perspective also affects how we understand God's timing. In a world that demands instant gratification, we often find ourselves impatient, frustrated, or disappointed when things don't happen on our schedule. We pray, work, and strive, yet the results seem delayed, and the answers to our prayers are not as immediate as we hope. Without trust, we can become resentful, questioning God's goodness and faithfulness. But trust enables us to embrace the waiting, to understand that God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own desires. Trust teaches us that delays are not denials, and that waiting is not wasted. We begin to see that God uses the waiting periods in our lives to build our character, deepen our faith, and prepare us for what lies ahead. Trust also shifts how we view the presence of God in our lives. There are times when we feel distant from God, when He seems silent, or when His presence feels far away. In those moments, our natural tendency may be to doubt God's faithfulness or question His love. But trust transforms our perspective in those moments. It reminds us that God's presence is not dependent on our feelings or our circumstances. Even when we cannot feel Him near, He is still with us, guiding, sustaining, and working on our behalf. Trust allows us to rest in the truth that God is faithful, even when we do not sense His immediate presence. This assurance enables us to move forward, trusting that He is always working, even when we cannot see it. As trust transforms our perspective, it opens the door to a deeper peace and joy, even in the midst of hardship. Life can be difficult, and we will face trials and challenges. But when we trust in God, we view those trials through the lens of His goodness and sovereignty. We know that He is working everything together for our good, and we can rest in that assurance. This transformation of perspective gives us a peace that the world cannot understand, a peace that transcends our circumstances and is rooted in the trust that God is in control. Ultimately, trust transforms not only our perspective, but also our entire way of living. It frees us from the tyranny of self-reliance and places our lives in the hands of a faithful, loving God. Trust gives us the courage to face each day with confidence, to embrace the future with hope, and to navigate our trials with peace. It shapes how we see the world, how we see others, how we see ourselves, and how we see God. Trust changes everything, because when we trust, we align ourselves with a greater reality, the reality that God is sovereign, He is good, and He is always at work for our good. And in this trust, we find the true freedom to live the life He has called us to live.